Great. Good morning, everybody. I would like to begin the third Perek and use the same methodology we used for the first Perek. So for those who are here or those who weren't, I'll explain what it is, maybe a review for you. What we're going to do is we're going to read through each Mishnah, and while we may have some questions to understand the debate or the nature of the debate, and I feel free to jump in with your questions, what I want to say is that our goal for the Mishnayot here is to try to understand what is the topic of each Mishnah, okay? And what I mean by that is if we had to summarize the Mishnah in one line, how would we summarize that Mishnah, okay? And the goal of this is twofold. First of all, I think that sometimes when we're learning Mishnayot or Gemara or really anything, it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of the debate. This person says this person says that. Why? What's his reasoning? What's the pasuk? What's the debate really about? Do they really mean it? What's the scope? What's the extent? And those are really important questions to study when we learn. But sometimes we miss kind of the bigger movement that's going on within our chapter or within our Masechet. And so when we were looking at the first chapter, rather than getting in this, getting mired in some of the details of how high does the sukkah have to be, or where can you build the sukkah under a tree, or what if the tree's really high up, or trying to understand exactly how the Mishnayot work, what they mean on a very particular level, we try to live a little bit more on the broader understanding of what is each Mishnah's topic, what's going on, what's the conversation about. And that's a different question than what does each opinion say? Does that make sense? And so what I want to do is we're going to start a new document. Our first document was Masechet Sukkah, Perek 1. So now we're up to Masechet Sukkah, Perek 2. Perek 3 rather, because Rav Stephen did Perek 2 on Perek Bet on Thursday. And so here we are on the third Perek. And so I'm going to share my screen. And actually I'm going to do a share where we can include. Okay. Is everybody with me? So just for example, this is the document we had last time. We kind of went each Mishnah, and as we went, we wrote in summaries of what was happening. Okay, so Mishnah 1 was about this, Mishnah 2 was about this, Mishnah 3 was about this, right? And we tried to get a sense of how the Perek as a whole was laid out. So we're going to do that again for the third Perek. So let's start. I'm going to put a little table in with 2 rows. 2 columns and lots of rows. And let's get started. So this is Mishnah 1. Make it a little bigger so everyone can see. All right. I'm going to read, but everyone please follow along and jump in with questions or comments as we go. Our goal is to try to get through the entire third Perek, which is, a mere 15 Mishnayot. So we're going to move pretty quickly and remember, our goal is to less getting into the particular details of any given Mishnah and more trying to understand what is each Mishnah about. Lulav hagazul v'hayavesh pasul.
Before you start, could you hold on 1 second, please? Can you make available the charts afterwards, after the shares or whatever, so we could print them?
100%. I'd be happy to. And I think I'm only teaching these 2 prakim out of the 5, but I think if you compare the charts and what we wrote to each Perek, you should be able to reproduce something similar for the other chapters for yourself, if that's something you're interested in doing, to get sort of a broader, holistic understanding of what's going on. Lulav hagazul v'hayavesh pasul. A lulav that is stolen or is totally dried out, it is prohibited to use. Shel ashera v'shel ir hanidachat pasul. If it was from an ashera tree or from a condemned city, that is also condemned city for having been fully idolatrous or enough idolatrous that the city has to be destroyed, that lulav is also prohibited to use. Or I don't know if it's prohibited. Prohibited would be asur. Maybe it's unfit. It doesn't work. Nichtam rosho nifritzu alav pasul. If its head was cut off, or if its leaves are spread out, it's going to be considered unfit. Nifridu alav kasher. But if its leaves were only spread out, but not as spread out as nifritzu, presumably. Nifritzu means like really pulled off kind of the spine. But nifridu just means a little bit spread out. That's going to be permitted. That's going to be kasher. Rabbi Yehud Omer, yegdenu milamala. You should, in a case where you have leaves that are spread out, try to bundle them back up around the top. Sine har habrazel kisherot. If you have a lulav from this particular area, the Iron Mountain, those are kasher. Lulav sheyeshbo shlosha tfachim kedei lenaneh bo kasher. And a lulav that has 3 tfachim, that is 3 tfachim tall, or 3 tfachim worth of shakeability, that is going to be kasher to use. Okay, there's a lot of laws about the lulav. Can somebody give me a summary? What is this Mishnah about? Okay, there's a lot of laws about the lulav, but the whole chapter is going to be about the various parts of the lulav. What are we doing here in this Mishnah? You don't have to jump in at once. Yeah, Milton?
It's classic for the mitzvah bo ba'avera, but maybe avera sort of mentioned maybe a little strong, maybe just mitzvah puzzle.
Yeah. Right. It's kind of like a funny thing that we see in Mishnah, Milton, which is that we often start off with negatives to define things, right? Like it's kind of a funny situation where in order to tell you what is a kosher lulav, we're going to give you a litany of things that make a lulav not kosher. And by implication, if it doesn't fall into any of these categories, presumably the lulav is going to be kosher, right? What I mean by that is at no point until now have we ever defined what is a lulav, right? The first 2 chapters deal with the structure of the sukkah and then how you sit in a sukkah. And now we're up to Mishnah Aleph of the 3rd Perek, and it's primarily about each of these. So far, at least, we're starting with the lulav, and all we do is define what are the things that make a lulav problematic, and what are kinds of lulavs that maybe you would have thought are problematic were actually permitted. So you're right to kind of notice the mitzvah haba ba'avera. Well, that feels like a particular detail here, whereas on a broad sense, we're dealing with like what are the characteristics of a pasul lulav and a kasher lulav. Yes, Isaac.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I find it interesting that there are, in terms of what makes a lulav unfit, that there are 2 categories, overreaching 2 categories: the physical attributes of the lulav itself, and also in what capacity it may have been used or in association with idolatry. So there are sort of 2 directions that we're talking about that makes a lulav unfit. And
yeah, good. So I think you're right, Isaac, to note the way like things that could be lulav unfit could be about how the lulav looks, right? How it looks,
right.
Also where it comes from, right? And the things are kind of combined or overlapping in a funny way, which I think Milton and Isaac are drawing us attention to, right? Lulav hagazul v'yavesh. Those are kind of like funny things to put in the same category. Either a stolen lulav or a dried out lulav, right? I would have thought to put lulav hagazul next to Asherah or Yernidacha. Listen, there's context that makes a lulav prohibited, and then there's characteristics that make a lulav prohibited. Context could be stolen, could be because it's connected to avodah zarah. Characteristics could be because it's too spread out, or because its head was cut off, or because it's dried out. But they're actually kind of interspersed within within this Mishnah. I think it's a great observation. Context and physical traits are interspersed. Very good observation, and grateful for it. Yes, Vivian.
Yeah, I was thinking that the important thing is what makes a fit lulav. So if you know all the characteristics that make it unfit, if it doesn't fit into any of those categories, then what you can derive from it is what is a suitable, a fit one.
Great, right? And by implication, everything else is permitted, right? If it doesn't, in some ways you would think like, oh, if I told you that the lulav needed to be this tall and this wide and this color, it would be really hard to find a kosher lulav. And here we kind of take the opposite approach. Look, listen, here are the disqualifiers for a lulav. If it comes from one of these three places, an asher, dachat, or stolen, that's disqualified. And if it's the leaves are pulled off, separated from the spine, or the head is cut off, or it's dried out, those are disqualifiers. So we have three physical characteristic disqualifiers and three contextual disqualifiers. All other lulavs are actually fine. That seems to sort of be the implication. So by focusing on the things that make it unfit, it actually winds up creating a much more expansive definition of what would be allowed. Thanks, Vivian.
So you're left with a very wide variety of fit ones.
Yes. Yes. Great. I'm gonna make this smaller. Okay, let's see Mishnah 2. This is the pace. Is everyone okay with? Yeah, Milton?
It just seems interesting to me that it starts out with a lulav in the sense that it's not just the palm, but it's the rest. It's the etrog and the arovos, etc.
Right.
Involved
At
sometimes.
no point we haven't defined the mitzvah. You could imagine a world in which we say mitzvah besukot litol etalulav hadas aravim vesrog. You could imagine kind of a mission that tells us, that defines kind of like the halacha about the lulav and esrog. But instead we kind of just jump in the beginning of this third chapter, right? We just jump in with, this is the first thing we know, is that, right, if we go back to the earlier Mishnah, there's nothing about lulav and esrog. So we really just jump in starting to define a lulav without giving any kind of context to the mitzvah. I think it's right? So I'm going to make further questions, thoughts. We have over here that, jump into the mitzvah to the description of lulav, to the, without even defining or explaining the broader mitzvah context. Great. Let's see the next Mishnah. Okay. Hadas hagazul v'hayavesh. Pasul. If you have your hadas, I think they usually translate as myrtle. If you have a myrtle that's stolen or dried out, pasul. Shal sherev shal dachat. Pasul. Same thing, just like the lulav, it can't come from a avodah zarah tree, and it can't come from a condemned city. Miktam rosho, if its head is cut off, or nifritzu alav, o shayu anavav mirubot me'alav, pasul. Right? If if the top was cut off, if its leaves were totally cut off, spread off to the point of being cut off, or if it has too many berries, right? If the berries overpower the leaves, then it's going to be pasul. V'im miatan kasher. But if you have, if you then peeled some of the berries off, if you took some of the berries off of the hadas, then the hadas would become kosher. So having too many berries is not it's not a be all and end all. You can ameliorate that problem by just taking some of the berries off. The ein mima'atin b'yom tov, but you can't do that on Yom Tov. So if on Erev Yom Tov you get your Hadass branch and you're like, oh my God, this Hadass branch has so much fruit on it, so many berries on it. All right, let me take some off. And now I can work through these. Now I can use this Hadass. But let's say it shows up on Yom Tov. And you're like, oh no, I can barely even see the leaves. There's so many berries just outnumbering and overpowering. You would not be allowed to take off the berries on Yom Tov. Okay. Great. So what's Mishnah 2? Feels kind of obvious. Characteristics of a Hadass.
The Hadass.
Right? And again, we go by unfit. This is how the language is framed. Any other comments or questions or notes on this Mishnah before we see the next Mishnah? And if you feel like we're moving quickly, it's because we are. Okay.
I think it's.
Yes, Vivian.
I think it's similar to the lulav. It's almost exactly the same thing applied to the hadass. That you give the characteristics that are unfit, and everything else seems to be okay. It gives you a very broad latitude.
So following up on what this is, Bert, following up. So why, if we've already established that you can't use a lulav, hagozel or whatever, why would we think that hadassah hagozel would be okay?
Great. It seems like I could have imagined a version which we said, kol arba minim im yavesh im gazul yavesh asher yadachat pasul. Right? It's like an interesting experience, Bert.
Stop at West 230th Street and Broadway.
Someone's driving somewhere great. I hope you make it there. So, great question, Bert. Like, it seems a little repetitive, and I think it's a good thing to notice, right? One could have imagined a way in which we lump these all into the same category, and that would be a very different thing. Okay. Arava, Gezula, Vivesha, Psula. An arava that is stolen or dried out is pasul, right? The willow branch. Similarly, if it's from an ashera or from a condemned city, it's pasul. Niktam rosha, nifritzu aleh, vehatzaf pisula. Right? If the leaves are pulled off or spread out so much that they come off, or it comes from a tzaf, which is a different species of willow, not the kind that's allowed, that's pasul, right? We saw with the lulav that if it comes from Har Barzel, the Iron Mountain, the location, it is permitted. But here for the willow, if it's a different kind of willow, it's not permitted. Kimusha, v'shen nashru miksa aleha, Vishel Baal,
Riverdale Avenue and Johnson Avenue.
I would just ask if you are driving somewhere, that's okay. But if you could just mute yourself because we're getting Waze's directions until you get home, that would be appreciated. We hope to see you arrive safely at home soon. So if the willow branch is a little bit dried out, or where only some of its leaves fell off, or if it comes not from a riverbank, but from a field that's more inland, then it is kasher. Okay, one might have thought that these things would be disqualifying, but in fact, they are not disqualifying.
Stop at Riverdale, Johnson Avenue.
So what's Mishnah 3? Okay, unfit arba. Any comments or notes on this one? Okay, so let's keep going. Now things are going to get interesting. We've defined a lulav and a hadass and a arava. Now what do we have to do once we know what each of the three things are? Got to put them all together. Mishnah 4. Okay, so this seems to take a little bit of a backwards approach, right? It's missing the intro paragraph, but now we sort of get into, okay, once we have each of these ingredients or each of these plants, what do we do with them? Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Shlosha hadasim ushtei aravot, lulav echad ve'etrog echad, afilu shenayim ketumim ve'echad eno katum. Rabbi Yishmael says you need 3 hadasim, 2 aravot, 1 lulav, and 1 etrog. Afilu shnayim ketumim ve'echad eno ketum. But you should know that for the hadassim, right? The way we know we're talking about hadassim is because where it says afilu shnayim ketumim ve'echad eno katum. The only thing that we have in our Mishnah that describes 3 is the hadassim. So in a case where you have even 2 that have their heads cut off, but 1 that's not cut off, that is permitted. Okay, so there seems to be some sense that even though we require 3, or we say the mitzvah is to have 3 hadassim, if 2 of them have their heads cut off, then you're still good to go. Rabbi Tarfon Omer afilu shlashtan ketumim. Rabbi Tarfon says even if all 3 tops of their heads are severed, that's permitted as well. Rabbi Akiva Omer kishem shelulav echad ve'etrog echad kach hadas echad ve'arava achat. Rabbi Akiva says, wait, you're telling me there's 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 2 aravot, and 3 hadassim? That's not true. Actually, you just need one of each kind of plant. Okay. What are questions or comments? And first, let's do a summary of this Mishnah. If you're being very specific, what's this Mishnah's topic? Anyone? It might feel easy. That's okay. The answer is not complicated. Yeah, Vivian? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll jump in. So how many of each branch? That's pretty much, we have this debate. Could be 3, is it 1? What if 2 are cut off? What if we're none? Right? Or what is the bare minimum? Right? But the main topic of this is how many of each branch component. And so there's a debate, but the point is that when you see is that the topic is the question of how many of each are we putting in. Okay. All right, let's see the next Mishnah. Sorry, 1 second. Just make sure that we can all see. Okay. Mishnah 5. Etrog hagazul vayavesh pasul. An etrog that's stolen or dried out is pasul. Shal asher v'shal yerni dachat. Pasul. If it comes from an asher tree or from an yerni dachat, it's pasul. Shal arla pasul. If it comes from the first 3 years of after it was planted, that's pasul. Shal truma tamaya pasul. If it was from truma that became tamei, that would be pasul. Shal truma tehora. Lo yitol natal kasher. You shouldn't take an etrog that is truma, but if you did take it, it is kasher. Shal demai beit shammai poslin beit hillel machshirin. If it comes from demai, which is stuff that we don't know if it has had truma and masar separated from it, right? Okay, so demai is things that we're unsure about whether the trumos or masros have been separated. In those cases, Beit Shammai says it's posel, it's unfit, and Beit Hillel says it is fit. Shel maaser sheni b'Yerushalayim lo yitol v'im natal kasher. If it's from maaser sheni in Yerushalayim, you shouldn't take it, but if you do, then it's kasher, right? Maaser sheni is that on the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th year of this Shemitah cycle, you bring a tenth of your crops to Jerusalem to either consume there or redeem there for money to then be able to buy things that you're going to consume there. So there's some sense that those things, you shouldn't use those esrogs that are part of your Maaser Sheni crop. You shouldn't use those for the mitzvah either.
Mm.
Okay. So what's this Mishnah about? Characteristics of an unfit etrog. Okay, so I have two questions for everybody. First of all, why do we have all these other rules for the etrog that we don't seem to have for the lulav or the hadassim or the aravot? All this truma stuff and maaser and demai. Why do we have different rules? Does anybody know? Okay, so
Yeah.
Vivian?
It seems that there are all kinds of possibilities, especially when they had the korbanot and Yerushalayim and all that. But it seems that in each situation, the Hillel group is more mekil, and the Shammai group are more machmir, and we go according to Beit Hillel.
Okay. That's a good observation, right? Part of this is that the Beit Hillel and Beit Hillel is more mekil here. But I guess my question is, why is the etrog a different category in terms of the maaser and truma? How come we didn't talk about any of those things for the lulav or the hadassim or the aravot?
Yeah, there are different requirements. It's you see that.
Good, right?
But, yeah,
It's,
but they say at least if there's one that's okay, then it's kosher, even though it's required 3. So he says that because all you need is one lulav and one etrog, you also need just one of the other things.
great. So if we
So,
go back to Mishnah 4, we
yeah.
see that we need one of each. And once we
One of
define you need
each.
one of each, now we're in the world of the esrog. And the esrog is a little bit different than the other. It's when you look at it in the chart that we made, it almost feels obvious that the etrog is being separated from the first 3, right? The first 3 are all plants, right? They're all kinds of branches. The lulav, hadas, arava. The etrog is a fruit, and the etrog gets its own special rules because it's a fruit, right?
Part of it,
Palm branches and willows and myrtles, we don't bring to Jerusalem. They don't have truma requirements. They don't have maaser requirements.
right.
We only
One
have truma and maaser requirements for fruit. And so
Rav
the etrog is being Bert, is being presented here in a different way, and I like seeing, even though it seems counterintuitive, the way the etrog gets separated from the first 3 branches with Mishnah 4, which defines what are the things that you actually need to bring. Yes, Bert.
Yeah, what I was going to say is the estrog is generally planted and farmed, whereas I don't know that hadassim and aravos. I never heard of a person say, I'm going to grow hadassim or aravos on my farm. Whereas there are estrog people who plant estrog trees. So one is, and that's the reason why, they don't require a maser and things of that nature, because generally people don't plant them. They grow sort of quasi in the wild.
Yeah, and even if you were to plant them, Bert, we don't have those requirements for non-fruit bearing things. Right? Like truma and maaser would apply to fruits and vegetables,
Do it for
grains.
Do it for wheat and other things like that.
Those are grains. I would include grains in fruit bearing categories.
Okay, grain is in fruit bearing. Yeah, okay, fine.
Yes.
Hey,
Yes.
This is Carol. I'm on the phone.
Hi, Carol.
So, we have very strict laws about food. Etrog is a food. You can make, jam out of it. You can make wine out of it, liqueur out of it. So it would be reasonable to have more rules about the etrog than you would about the lulav.
Right, it's a fruit, and fruit has different requirements, particularly around the areas of all these things that you're supposed to do in Jerusalem, right? It has much more functionality. You can use an etrog for all kinds of things, right? For liquor, for samim, for it is just a fruit, right? So
Right.
nowadays, we like our relationship to the etrog is pretty exclusively surrounding the mitzvah, and even like an etrog liqueur sort of feels like a novelty item for Sukkot. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't. It's not like I don't know if anybody who really drinks like a etrog liqueur or an etrog jam, not really in conjunction to etrog as a mitzvah object, right?
Mhm.
Whereas if you go to the east, the citron is a popular citrus fruit in a different kind of way. There's a fruit called, I don't know if you've ever seen this before. I think it's called Buddha's hands, and it's a kind of citron. I'm gonna show it to you.
You
This is
can't
a kind
see
of
it.
citron, but in the east it grows like this with these. So if you look at this picture, you can sort of see the way it looks like an estrog, but then it spirals out into these kind of finger-like things. It's a little different than what you're used to. And so this is a kind of citron as well. And so in other parts of the world, this is a much more common crop than we have in the West. It's super interesting and different, right?
Oh.
One of the things, Rav Ezra, that I think is interesting is that it's unspecified in the Torah as to what a pre-Eitz Hadar is. It's, it's
Totally.
Halacha Moshe Sinai. As far as I'm concerned, a great orange could be a pre-Eitz Hadar, or a lemon, not necessarily an esrog. So I think it's worth noting that, it's a Halacha Moshe Sinai that we have, that what constitutes a pre-Eitz Hadar, namely an esrog.
100%. 100%, right? And if you see, even in it's halacha mashvisina, but not only that, if you see in the Gemara, there seems to be a debate about what is an esrog. So it's sort of like halacha mashvisina. It's also sort of like a big kind of open question that continues into the rabbinic period. Yeah, Lance. I can't hear you actually. Something's going on with your microphone. You're unmuted, but I can't hear you. I'm sorry, Lance. You want to try again in a few minutes? So you can play around with it? Okay. Alta chazazit al rubo, nitla pitmato, niklaf, nistak, nika v'chasar kol shehu pasul. Okay, so etrog wins the category, wins the prize of being the first Mishnah that gets the first topic that gets a second Mishnah around it, right? That gets a second level description about what makes not kosher esrog. And here we're going to start giving all these characteristics. If it has lots of blemishes around the outside, around the main body of it, around the majority of it. Nitla pitmato, if its pitom falls off. Niklaf, nistak, nika, v'chasar kosher, if parts were peeled or split or poked holes into them, or any section is lacking, missing in some way, that's also going to be unfit for using as an esrog. Alta chazazit miuto, vital ukzo, nikav velo chasar kosher kasher. But if it has a few blemishes on it, just on a minority of an area, or the other side, not the pitom side, but the stem side comes off, or it has a hole, but nothing is actually missing, then it would still be permitted. Yes, Lance.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. What is the proof text for waving the lulav on Sukkot?
Great. I want to hold your question. Can I ask you to hold the question for now?
Yes, I thought that Bert opened the door, but sure. Just
All
let
right,
me know when you want to address it. No problem.
Well, I want to keep questions to the text that we're studying in this moment, and let's hold off. I'll open it up. I'll put a better question. What is the proof text for shaking the lulav? Because we haven't yet mentioned anywhere that shaking the lulav is even a mitzvah. No one. We did mention that you need 3 tvachim of shaking material, but we haven't offered a proof text question. So I think it's a good question, but let's hold off on it for now. The Mishnah hasn't offered anything yet.
No problem. Thank you.
Great. Let's jump to Mishnah 6. So we're in Mishnah 6. Let's finish it up. Etrog hakushi, an Ethiopian etrog. Unclear. Here in the translation it says, which is black like a Cushite, is unfit. I don't know if that is one way of interpreting Kushi, but I can imagine other ways. Could just be about the region where the etrog comes from, rather than a description of its color. Vayarok kecharti, and if it's an etrog that's green, like a leek, Rabbi Meir machshir, Yehuda posel. Rabbi Meir says it's permitted, and Rabbi Yehuda says it is prohibited. Great. So this is, what's Mishnah 6? Characteristics continued of an one of the things that we see in this is different level of scope than the first 3 branches. Okay, kind of just want to note that, right? Whereas the first 3 branches, we didn't really move into defining what is a lulav, what is a hadas, what is a ha'arava. Here we're getting a little closer. Okay, what does it look like? There's a lot more features or facets that's painting in some way a clearer picture of what the etrog looks like. Great. Let's do Mishnah 7. Shiur etrog hakatan. Rabbi Meir omer ke'egos. Rabbi Yehuda omer kebeitzam. The bare minimum size of an etrog is, according to Rabbi Meir, like egos, like a walnut, and Rabbi Yehuda says like an egg size. Uvigadol, and what's the largest size an etrog could be? Kedei sheyochaz shnayim biado achat. Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it's so big that you wouldn't be able to hold 2 of them in one hand, then that would be too big. So most of the etrog we can have, you could imagine being able to hold 2 in one hand. It doesn't necessarily mean holding it comfortable. It doesn't mean wrapping your whole hand around it, but that you would be able to grasp 2 etrogim. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Yossi said, Yossi says, even if one etrog requires 2 hands to hold, and you've probably seen large etrog before, right? Look at the picture. Have you ever seen this kind of a big, huge etrog, right? Where you really couldn't hold 2 of those, this kind of etrog. We'll do 1. So according to Rabbi Yossi, that even that size is kosher. So Mishnah 7 then we're looking at is, we've left sort of the characteristics of an unfit etrog. We've moved into the size of an etrog. Okay. Any other comments or questions about Mishnah Zion? I know we're moving at a pace. That's with the intention of recognizing that we're mostly just getting a basic bare bones structure of the Perek as we encounter each of the various laws. Let's go to Mishnah 8. Ein ogdin et halulav ela bimino. You can only bind the lulav with its own species. Dear Rabbi Yehuda, as Rabbi Yehuda says. What do we mean by that? Binding the lulav with its own species? Right? The question is, can you use string? Could I use some duct tape to put the lulav together with the other plants? No, you can only use a lulav branch. Rabbi Meir Omer afilu b'mishicha. Rabbi Meir says one may do so even with anything. So this is a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says you can only use lulav, and Rabbi Meir says anything that you would use to wrap things, like a string, a rope. I'm Rabbi Meir. Maseh b'anshe Yerushalayim. There's a story about the people of Jerusalem. Shayu ogdin et lulavehen begimoniot shel zahav. they used to use gold rings. I'm imagining I'm less imagining kind of like a ring that you wear in your finger and more like a napkin holder. You know, those like napkin rings that you sometimes get in for people who set formal tables, right? You have those napkin rings. So you can imagine kind of like a nice fancy ring being used to put around your lulav and the other branches to hold them all together. Amrulo bimino hayu ogdino to milmata. No, first they would bind it with a lulav wrapping. They would use one leaf of a lulav to create a wrap, and then they would put that ring on top. But don't think the ring was what was used for the binding. The ring was just used to make it look beautiful, to make it look cool or special. But the binding itself actually happened with with this golden material. So the response is, listen, even though Rabbi Meir says you could use anything, even a string or a cord or a rope, the story shouldn't be an illustration of being able to use anything. Rather, the story works, or might even be limited to wrapping with an actual lulav branch, something that comes from its own species, and the golden part is just decorative. Okay. And by the way, one thing to note here for Mishnah 8 is they don't say ein ogdin et lulav im hadasim aravot. Right here, are they talking about binding all of the plants together, or are they talking about just the lulav itself? If the leaves are a little spread out, how do we make sure they stay together? Okay, use its own lulav leaf. And by the way, you see this, by the way, when we take our lulav and etrog together, we use lulav branches to kind of wrap them, and then we also use that holder, which is made from lulav branches, lulav leaves as well. So we see both of those layers. There's the wrapping of the lulav itself and the wrapping of all of the branches together. Great. Mishnah 9. Lance, your question is going to become much more relevant now. Okay.
Great.
And how would they shake it? Vahodu Lashem Tchila V'Sof. So let's pull it up a little bigger. Uva'ana Hashem Oshiana, Divrei Rabbi Hillel. Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel says the places where you shake the lulav, they don't say anything about making a bracha and shaking the lulav. They talk about shaking the lulav in the context of halal, right? That we shake the lulav in the context of halal. Divrei Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai reim af ba'ana Hashem atzlichana. Beit Shammai says, okay, yes, it's true with hodu and with ana Hashem Oshiana, but also those last two lines, we shake the lulav as well. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, Sofeh hayiti b'Rabban Gamliel uva Rabbi Yehoshua. I was watching Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yehoshua, shekol ha'am, with Rabban Gamliel. I was with Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yehoshua, and we saw that all shekol ha'am hayu min na'anim et lulavehen. We noticed that everyone was shaking their lulavs. Vehin lo nin'u ela ba'ana Hashem Hoshiana. And they only shook for Ana Hashem Hoshiana. So essentially we have this debate between Hillel and Shammai, sort of the Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the OG Tanaim, the original Tanaim, are these two schools of shaking. When do we shake? Do we shake during Ana Hashem Hoshiana and Ana Hashem Aslichana, or just during Ana Hashem Hoshiana? And it's a debate, but then Rabbi Akiva says, reports that he was with Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua, and they noticed that everybody, like the minhag, what did everybody do? The minhag was to only shake during Ana Hashem Hoshiana. Okay, so they're noting, there may be this theoretical debate, but in terms of what the actual practice was, decades or centuries later, the practice became that everyone only shakes during Ana Hashem Hoshiana. Mishaba b'derech v'lo haya biyado lulav litol. If somebody's traveling, they don't have a lulav to take. When he gets home, he should just shake his lulav on his table. If let's say he wasn't able to shake his lulav during the morning prayer, he should shake his lulav during the afternoon prayer or later in the day. Shekol hayom kasher lulav, because the entire day is suited for the mitzvah of lulav. Okay, so what do we see in Mishnah 9 is the question of when do we shake the lulav? Okay, so if we looking at the structure of the chapter, first we defined what a lulav is. Well, sort of defined. We defined at least what a lulav isn't, or what makes an not okay lulav. We defined an unfit hadas, an unfit harabah. We talked about how many of each we need. Then we moved into the estrog world. We spent 3 Mishnah describing what's an unfit etrog, and what's the size of etrog. Then we talked about what material used to wrap the lulav. And now the question of when do we shake the lulav? And this, I would say, is 2 categories, both within tefillah or even outside the context of, both within tefillah, particularly, and when during day.
Rav Ezra? I know
Yes,
that
Bert.
this is not part of the Mishnah, and this is going to deflect you. I just wanted to make mention of the fact that it occurred to me, does this make the lulav and esrog a mitzvah sasesha hazman grama, and that, that women are therefore exempt from doing this, since half the group here is women?
Well, the question stands regardless of whether women are learning with us. But
No,
yeah,
but
lulav and etrog are mitzvah
from
are
women.
mitzvah zman grama. They are, because they're daytime mitzvot, and also they're taken during a specific time of the year.
As a mitzvah sasesha hazman grama.
And the question is why, if you can do it all day?
Right. If you could do it all day, why is it a mitzvah sasesha hazman grama?
So the mitzvah zman grama could be about day versus night distinction, or right, we take the lulav during the day but not at night. So it's not a continuous mitzvah, and also it's time bound in its calendrical setting, right? The mitzvah to keep Shabbos, right, is different than well, I guess maybe not. Maybe the truth of the mitzvah says man grama of Shabbos, maybe Kiddush. There are debates, or Havdalah. There are debates around those whether the mitzvah says man grama or not. But the mitzvah of lulav and esrog only comes once a year for that week, and so that also defines it as mitzvah say shazman grama.
How about the fact that for saying Hallel, that goes together with Shachrit davening, and that certainly there's a Zman Grama on that.
Great,
I mean,
great. Well,
there's a required time on it.
Okay, good, but it's Isaac. You're right that sort of functionally they think it should take place during Hallel or Shacharit, but then it's also clear if you were traveling or if you weren't able to take it during Shacharit, you could take it later in the day, and that's
Right.
it's not ma'akev.
But is there an ideal? I mean, is there any?
The ideal would be to, when you're saying Hallel at Shacharit, to shake your lulav at that time, and then but we recognize that if you're not able to meet that because someone has your lulav, you forgot it, you're on the road, whatever it is, don't think you haven't missed the time of the lulav. And so even though the time is the whole day or the whole week, maybe even, although probably just only the first day of Sukkot, nonetheless, it's still a mitzvah say shazman grama. So great question about mitzvah say shazman grama. Let's hear the next Mishnah. Mishnah 10. Mishaya eved o isha o katan makrinoto. If you have somebody who presumably doesn't if he has somebody who's reciting Hallel on his behalf. Okay, so this is the opposite. It's right. Let's say you have a servant or a woman or a child who's the one reciting Hallel. He should oneh acharehen ma shehin omrim. He should respond. What is the thing that they've said? Utihilo meira, and the Mishnah makes this gratuitous kind of insult on the fact that he doesn't know how to say the prayer, which I'm not necessarily supportive of. But they're saying, how embarrassing or how ignorant of him that he needs somebody else to recite Hallel for him. I don't know. We could talk about. It's a separate conversation about this kind of judgment on the person who doesn't didn't have the access to learn the Hebrew. Imaya gadol makreoto oneh acharav hallelujah. But if there's an adult male reciting Hallel on his behalf, then he can just answer hallelujah. Right? Part of this is based on the idea of the mitzvah seishezman grama that Bert brought up. This question of, are these other people chayiv in the mitzvah? And the Mishnah seems to say that an eved or a katan or an isha, they're not obligated in the same level. Therefore, if they saying Hallel, he can't just answer Amen or Hallelujah. Hallelujah. He can't be Yotzei with Shomea Ka'ona. This is a principle that somebody is saying a prayer and they're also obligated in that prayer. Even if you don't say it, even if you just respond to Amen or hear them say it out loud, that's good enough. But if they aren't obligated in the mitzvah, then you can't absolve your own obligation by listening to them. So therefore, you would have to say it yourself. And that's why the Mishnah is clear. Makrinoto oneh achrayhen. He answers after them. He repeats after them. But if there was a gadol, somebody who was obligated in the mitzvah, then all you have to do is listen. And that's going to be enough to be yotzei. So after describing what material to use throughout the lulav, when do we say through the lulav? Now we say, this is sort of a question of who is obligated to say it. And what if a adult man doesn't know how? Okay, so Mishnah 10 now moves into the question of, after we've defined all the objects and the time period, now we started engaging with, let's talk about a particular person. How does he engage with this mitzvah? What if he's unable to say Hallel? What does he do? Hallel, not holler. Okay. Mishnah 11.
Rav Ezra, if you can't, even if you can't say those things, can't you just say the bracha and be yotzei with the mitzvah of taking lulav and esrog?
Great. So to nowadays, we've kind of like moved into the way most of us experience lulav and esrog is much more about the bracha and shaking. But it seems clear from the Mishnah, Bert, that bracha and shaking is not the ikar. Rather, the ikar is shaking your lulav at the moments of Hallel, where you're supposed to say it. It's actually, and this becomes like a big kind of discussion, particularly in the brisker world, of is the mitzvah of, what is the relationship between the mitzvah of lulav and Hallel? Is mitzvah lulav somehow like a particular subcategory of a special kind of Hallel, or is its own mitzvah that connects to Hallel next to it? And there's a lot of theoretical debate, i.e., what if you don't know how to say Hallel? What if you only have time to make a bracha and shake, etc.? So your question is a good one, and I'll write it down. Great. Mishnah 11. Makom shanagu lichpol yichpol. Livshot yivshot. Levarech acharav yivarech acharav. Hakol k'minhag hamedina. In terms of the reciting Hallel, there's lots of debates about how to recite Hallel. Some phrases are repeated, and we do this, right? We repeat some phrases twice. Some phrases you say responsively. Some you make the blessing at the end. There's all these debates around how to recite Hallel. And the Mishnah says, listen, you follow the minhag, right? Let's say your town does it differently. Follow the minhag of the town. It's kind of a funny Mishnah, right? It's like a weird kind of halacha to teach in the context of lulav and esrog. I could have imagined Hallel being somewhere else. And here yet there, and Bert, I think this in some ways goes to like exemplify the thing we just said from before based on your question, that somehow fundamental to the shaking of lulav is this Hallel question or the Hallel component. It's actually a key, crucial part of the mitzvah.
Historically, start saying Hallel. In other words, did they start saying Hallel? As soon as they entered it was a formalization of it. But they had the mitzvah of doing it, once they entered Eretz Yisrael, So, but they didn't have the Hallel tefillah then. So they must have done something because they had to take Pluriate's Hadar.
Why do you think they didn't have a Hallel prayer?
Because how many, because I don't know when they formalized the tefillot.
Right. So you could imagine a Hallel even if it was informal.
I'm just simply saying is, but it's not informal because there's a formalized thing here, Hodu and other stuff like that. I'm not sure when the siddur was formalized, and
Right. I'm saying even these lines are describing, there's one or two lines. It could have been that they didn't have all the paragraphs we say now.
yeah, but I don't even know if they had those
In
paragraphs.
Sukkah, they talk about more of Hallel.
Right. Even Psachim, according to Gloria, they don't talk more about Hallel. But when they, before there was a Beis Hamikdash, they still were required to do all of these things, and they still were saying Hallel at that point. I don't know historically. Maybe you'll tell me.
Yeah. Well, so it's pretty clear from the sort of later Nach that it describes the avoda and the Beit Hamikdash being in conjunction with Hallel. Various forms of Hallel, not necessarily the Hallel we have today, but them reciting some kinds of psalms or praises together with the avoda. And remember, lulav and etrog is deeply embedded and connected to temple ritual, even more so, way more than anything we think about today, because we've so far removed it from that.
They were doing this before there was a temple, is the point I'm making. They were doing this, before David HaMelech, even contemplated.
I know, but it doesn't. I don't care whether. In my mind, it doesn't matter to me whether. Let's add some rows here.
All right, it's okay. That's fine.
Yeah, I think we should be less. Meaning, they're debating what's going on in their time. Presumably, before they had this debate, people either were coalesced around a particular line, and maybe as Hallel expanded, there became more debates about which parts you should shake during. But I don't think it's crazy to think there was some kind of prayer or praise component with the shaking, but I agree they weren't reciting formal Hallel in the way we say it today. Is that good? Let's go back to Mishnah 11.
No,
I want to try to get
not
through.
good. Not good.
Not good?
Nope. I want to
Yes,
know.
please.
I
Yeah.
want to know how you know that Hallel was recited in a temple. What evidence is there?
I don't have the Sukkim right now, but if you look in Tehillim and Divrei Hayamim, and in I believe Ezra and Nehemiah, there are Sukkim that describe the service of the Beit Hamikdash, the Kohanim and Leviim doing it with Shira and with Hallel. So I don't.
But there's no
have
waving.
citations off the top of my head. What?
There can't be any waving because the waving took place on Passover. There is a proof
Hanafa.
text. What's that?
Hanafa, to wave. It's a different word than na'anuim.
No, but there was a wave
Shake.
offering on Passover.
I know. So those are waving offerings. That's a different to me, that's not necessarily the same thing as na'anuim, shaking.
But there's show me the proof text for waving the lulav on Sukkot in the Torah.
Yeah, it's not there. We
It's
both know
not
that.
there. It's not there, but it is there on Passover. But the rabbis have instituted this without a proof text, right?
Yeah, that's not crazy. I actually think
it's a rabbinic fiction.
Lance, I would make an argument, and this is just off the cuff here. First of all, I'm okay with rabbinic fictions, but second of all, I would make the argument.
I love Hallel.
Yeah, I would make the argument that part of shaking could be a way of manifesting taking, right? The pasuk says ulakachtem, right? You shall take for yourself. So if I'm in my house and I took it and I put it in my pocket or do something, it's hard to see that as an act of taking. Part of right, if I go to CVS and I buy something, part of the buying it is that I have the bag and I lift it up and I take it home with me, right? That's part of the acquisition, is some kind of physical movement. And so it's not crazy to me to see that physical movement of taking be getting exaggerated or built out into an act of shaking. I don't think it's such a far off idea from the idea of L'kachtem. I think you're right. It also interestingly relates to other things like the hanifa, the shaking of various sacrifices, or the waving. But that's a conversation for another time. All right, we got to stop here. I know people are here for the Chabura. We again got to, we only have a few Mishnayot left, and we missed the rest, but you can follow along on the structure. This is the last thing I'll say here, is if you start looking at the structure of Mishnah, it shows an interesting kind of, I don't know, pattern or way of thinking about the Mishnah. Remember, this whole chapter is focused on the lulav and esrog, and here's the order. First, we define the lulav, then we define the hadas, then we define that rabbah, then we define how many of each, then we jump to the etrog, which sort of needs its own section because there's so many more aspects and details about the etrog that affect its fitness, its ability to be utilized for the mitzvah. Then we move into what we used. How do we wrap the lulav? When do we shake the lulav? Who is obligated to recite the Hallel? How is the Hallel fit together with the lulav? Then we move into the questions of following certain minhagim, and then we jump into the rest. But we'll have to pause here. So thank you very much for the learning today, for moving through these Mishnayot. We still have a few Mishnayot left. There's homework for each of us to learn on our own to try to complete the Masechet. And I'll make the pages available to you. Feel free to email me, and I'll send them to you. And it's great to learn together today.
Thank you, Rev Ezra.
Thank you.
Guys. Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Lance. Thanks, Bert. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you so much. From
Yeah,
trying
thank
Carol.
you, Rav Ezra. Thank